High over Germany in 1944, a lone P-51 Mustang rolls inverted and points its nose straight down toward a tight formation of Focke-Wulf 190s. To the veteran German pilots watching, this near vertical plunge looks like a fatal mistake. Pulling out at extreme velocities usually shears the wings off or completely locks the flight controls. But this steep dive is not a suicidal act of panic. It is a meticulously calculated equation of gravity, terminal velocity, and human psychology, executed at 500 miles per hour. To understand why a pilot would intentionally hurl his aircraft toward the Earth at fatal speeds, we must examine a hidden science that irrevocably changed aerial warfare. This is the documented account of a new breed of highly analytical American aviators, specifically men like Captain Richard Turner of the 354th Fighter Group, who successfully transformed the Mustang's kinetic energy into a deadly, calculated science. For these pilots, survival in the European theater was no longer defined by raw instinct or the chaotic turning circles of traditional dogfighting. Instead, they treated the airspace as a rigid, unforgiving physics problem. By strictly adhering to known aerodynamic limits and mastering closure rate arithmetic, a solitary aircraft could now systematically shatter a numerically superior enemy squadron before the opposition even understood they were under attack. The intellectual pressure of this doctrine was immense. Pilots were required to convert theoretical physics, weight distribution, and complex structural thresholds into a real-time combat advantage, all while operating in a violently hostile sky. A single mathematical error in altitude or speed meant catastrophic failure. So how exactly did an aviator calculate the precise fraction of a second an enemy formation would mentally and physically crack under this pressure? And what actually happened in the cockpit when committing to such a high-speed ambush pushed the physical airframe of the airplane to the absolute brink of destruction? The catalyst for pushing these machines to their absolute structural limits was the presence of the Focke-Wulf 190. By mid-1944, deep escort missions over the German Reich had become a brutal, unforgiving crucible for American fighter groups. The primary adversary waiting for them at operational altitudes was not just flak, but highly aggressive Luftwaffe squadrons flying the FW-190A series. This aircraft was a formidable piece of engineering, built around the massive BMW 801 radial engine and heavily armed with up to 4 20mm cannons in the wings. Just one or two high-explosive shells from these weapons were mathematically sufficient to sever the main wing spar of an Allied fighter. When a P-51 Escort got jumped by a formation of Focke-Wulfs, the raw human instinct was to brake horizontally, to pull the stick hard, and enter a tight turning dogfight in an attempt to outmaneuver the attacker. But this was exactly the reaction Luftwaffe doctrine relied upon. The Focke-Wulf possessed an extraordinarily rigid wing structure and an advanced push-rod control system, granting it a roll rate that almost no Allied fighter could match at medium to low altitudes. In a horizontal engagement, the German pilot could snap roll and change his flight vector in a fraction of a second, effortlessly cutting across the turning circle of a Mustang. Any American pilot who bled off his speed to enter a slow-speed horizontal turning contest quickly found those 4 cannons perfectly aligned in his rearview mirror. Engaging a Focke-Wulf in a horizontal turning fight was a proven, lethal mistake. American fighter groups quickly realized they could not survive fighting on the enemy's terms. They had to dictate the parameters of the battle, using energy maneuverability. The doctrine required American pilots to utilize their altitude advantage, waiting until they held a superior position before rolling inverted and diving on the enemy formations. The tactical concept was to trade potential energy, altitude, for kinetic energy, speed. They would strike in a blinding, high-speed pass, utilizing that massive momentum to zoom safely back up to altitude, resetting the trap without ever giving the German pilots a chance to bring their heavy forward guns to bear. The P-51 Mustang was uniquely equipped for this tactic due to a revolutionary aerodynamic feature, the laminar flow wing. Unlike older fighters with thick, blunt wing edges, The Mustang's wing was specifically designed to be thinnest further back along its chord, drastically reducing aerodynamic drag. When a Mustang pilot pointed his nose down and pushed the throttle forward, the aircraft accelerated faster than almost any other propeller-driven fighter in the European theater. It built kinetic energy at a staggering, terrifying rate. However, this unprecedented aerodynamic efficiency harbored a fatal flaw. As the Mustang plunged toward the earth, its speed built relentlessly, passing 400, then 450, then approaching 500 miles per hour. The aircraft entered a realm of physics that its designers had barely begun to understand. As the airframe neared Mach 0.8, the air rushing over the thickest part of that highly efficient laminar flow wing accelerated even faster than the aircraft itself. The air passing over the metal actually broke the speed of sound locally, even though the plane as a whole was still flying subsonic. This created a terrifying aerodynamic phenomenon known as compressibility. Invisible, violent shock waves rapidly formed across the upper surface of the wings. The smooth, predictable airflow abruptly separated, turning into a chaotic, hammering wake of turbulence that slammed directly into the tail section of the aircraft. For the pilot trapped inside the cockpit, the onset of compressibility was unmistakable and horrifying. The airframe would begin to shudder violently, accompanied by a deafening roar. But the true danger was mechanical. The turbulent wake coming off the wings effectively created a dead zone of air over the elevators. The control stick would instantly freeze solid, as if encased in hardening concrete. The pilot was suddenly reduced to a passenger inside a screaming, unguided missile plummeting straight down. No amount of human physical strength could pull the nose up. If a panicked aviator grabbed the mechanical trim wheel, desperately trying to force the elevator tabs to pitch the nose up, the mechanism might fail to respond in the thin, supersonic airflow. But as the aircraft continued to plunge, losing thousands of feet of altitude in seconds, it would eventually hit the denser air closer to the Earth. If the trim tabs were left rolled back when that thicker air grabbed the control surfaces, the nose would violently jerk upward at over 500 miles per hour. The resulting G-force would instantly shear both wings clean off the fuselage. This physical reality created an agonizing dilemma for the men flying escort missions. They were caught in an impossible vice. If they stayed level and attempted to turn with the aggressive German formations, they would be outrolled and shredded by devastating 20mm cannon fire. But if they utilized their only real advantage, the Mustang's ability to dive and build massive speed, they risked hitting an invisible aerodynamic wall, freezing their controls and dying by the unforgiving laws of physics. Caught between superior German firepower and a fatal structural limitation, the American airframes had reached their absolute threshold. The solution to breaking this deadly stalemate could not be found by pushing the Mustang any faster. Analyzing this seemingly impossible situation, a few highly methodical flight leaders realized the answer lay entirely outside the aircraft's technical manual. The key to surviving this trap required looking past the aerodynamics and directly into the rigid, predictable combat training of the men flying the Focke-Wulfs. The tactical breakthrough did not originate in an engineering laboratory at North American Aviation, nor did it come from a high-level strategic manual issued by the War Department. It emerged directly from the stark, smoke-filled debriefing huts of the 354th Fighter Group in early 1944. Here, men like Captain Richard Turner began meticulously dissecting the defensive behaviors of the Luftwaffe. They were no longer just swapping chaotic combat stories. They were actively reverse engineering German fighter doctrine through the lens of pure mathematics. Sifting through dozens of frantic after-action reports, these flight leaders identified a rigid, almost mechanical pattern in the enemy's tactics. When subjected to a high-altitude bounce, veteran German formations did not immediately scatter in panic. Instead, Luftwaffe squadron commanders drilled their men to hold their tight defensive boxes. This discipline was designed to maximize their concentrated rearward firepower and present an intimidating wall of aircraft to the attacker. German pilots were strictly trained to maintain this formation until the attacking American aircraft closed to a highly specific tactical threshold, exactly 1,000 yards. Only when the enemy breached that invisible perimeter were the Focke-Wulfs instructed to break violently apart, utilizing their superior roll rate to ruin the attacker's firing solution and drag them down into a lethal, horizontal dogfight. For analytical American aviators, this rigid adherence to defensive doctrine was not a threat. It was a highly exploitable vulnerability. The engagement was no longer a question of outturning the Focke-Wulf, but strictly a problem of closure rate. A standard pursuit approach gave the German pilots ample time to spot the threat, visually measure the distance, and smoothly execute their defensive split. But the Americans ran the numbers on a maximum performance dive. If a P-51 Mustang rolled inverted and pushed its airspeed to 480 miles per hour, while the German formation cruised below at a standard combat speed of 250, the relative closure rate became staggeringly violent. At a speed difference of over 230 miles per hour, the Mustang was eating up the sky at nearly 340 feet every single second. At that velocity, the critical 1,000-yard defensive buffer relied upon by the Luftwaffe evaporated instantly. By deliberately approaching at 480 miles per hour, an American pilot swallowed the enemy's entire safety margin in a heartbeat. From the precise moment the Mustang crossed the 1,000-yard line to the moment its 50-caliber machine guns were in lethal firing range, the German pilots would be left with less than 2 seconds to physically recognize the breach, manipulate their heavy flight controls, and snap out of formation. 2 seconds was simply not enough time for human biology and mechanical linkages to process the threat and react. The formation would inevitably shatter in confusion, rather than breaking in a coordinated, lethal maneuver. The mathematics of this ambush were flawless on a chalkboard, but they demanded a terrifying compromise in the air. To achieve that exact closure rate, a pilot had to willingly push his Mustang to the absolute precipice of the compressibility red line. Shaving those critical seconds off the enemy's reaction time required diving so fast that the wings were just fractions of a degree away from generating the supersonic shock waves that would freeze the control stick and doom the aircraft. It was an extreme calculation of risk versus reward. The pilot had to intentionally ride the ragged edge of terminal aerodynamic failure, just long enough to paralyze the enemy's psychological discipline. The theory, forged in the debriefing room, promised total tactical dominance, but actually executing this attack math in combat required a terrifying game of high-speed chicken with both the Luftwaffe and the unforgiving laws of physics. Image prompt: a premium high-angle 3D digital architectural reconstruction of the Neolithic settlement of Çatalhöyük under a harsh midday sun. The steep, overhead bird's-eye perspective looks straight down onto a vast, dense cluster of interconnected adobe housing units, creating a completely unbroken plane of flat mud brick roofs. The layout emphasizes geometric uniformity and a total absence of street grids, intersections, alleys, or public squares, causing a sense of architectural disorientation. Strong natural light casts minimal, sharp geometric shadows along the slight structural elevation variances of the windowless mud houses, highlighting the textures of clay, plaster, and sun-baked earth. The grounded color palette is dominated by deep terracotta, ochre, and rich river mud gray, presenting a clean, scientifically accurate visual for an educational science documentary segment. Short reason: the steep bird's-eye perspective explicitly reveals the total absence of street grids, crossroads, or squares, emphasizing the alien, continuous mud brick honeycomb matrix of Çatalhöyük in a grounded documentary style. Once the trigger was released and the high-speed firing pass abruptly concluded, the tactical math evaporated. The American pilot was immediately confronted with a brutal, physiological reality. He was now trapped at the very bottom of a massive plunge, traveling at nearly 500 miles per hour, right in the middle of a scattering swarm of heavily armed Focke-Wulfs. He had traded all of his protective altitude for kinetic energy to execute the ambush, and to survive the next few seconds, he desperately needed to get that altitude back. The only way out of the kill zone was to wrench the nose of the aircraft violently toward the sky, converting that terrifying speed back into a steep, vertical climb. But altering the flight vector of a fully loaded fighter plane traveling near terminal velocity requires overcoming monumental inertia. As the pilot pulled back hard on the control stick, the Mustang's nose pitched up, instantly subjecting both the machine and the man inside to crushing centrifugal forces. The aircraft routinely pulled up to 6 Gs during this extreme recovery. While the metal airframe groaned under the immense aerodynamic load, the human body was pushed into a severe physiological crisis. Without the mechanical pressure suits that would become standard in later eras, there was no physical defense against this trauma. The sustained gravitational force violently dragged the blood away from the pilot's brain, pooling it heavily in his lower extremities. First, color vision drained away, leaving a stark monochrome gray. Then, peripheral awareness rapidly collapsed into a tight, narrow tunnel. Within 2 or 3 seconds of initiating the high-speed pull-up, the brain was so starved of oxygenated blood that the optic nerve simply shut down. The pilot's vision snapped to total, absolute black. He was still fully conscious, his hands locked in a death grip on the flight controls, but he was entirely blind. Surviving the ambush was no longer about calculating closure rates. It required the aviator to fly a structurally stressed machine straight up through a deeply hostile, chaotic formation while completely deprived of sight. He could hear the engines screaming and feel the violent shuddering of the wings bowing under the extreme strain, hoping against hope he would not collide with a fleeing German fighter in the darkness. It demanded a blind, terrifying faith in the Mustang's engineering to endure that crushing pull-up, a violent reality that was about to be tested to its absolute limit in one defining plunge. The moment of truth arrived when Captain Richard Turner of the 354th Fighter Group spotted a disciplined box of Focke-Wulf 19Os cruising below. The German pilots maintained their tight defensive formation, scanning the horizon for a standard Allied approach. Instead, Turner rolled his Mustang inverted, shoved the throttle forward, and pointed the nose of his aircraft directly at the earth. Gravity and the highly efficient laminar flow wing took immediate hold. Inside the freezing cockpit, Turner watched the needle on his airspeed indicator surge rapidly past 400 miles per hour. The altimeter spun wildly, shedding thousands of feet in mere seconds. At 450 miles per hour, a high-pitched, metallic scream resonated through the airframe as a rushing wind battered the canopy. Approaching 480 miles per hour, the invisible aerodynamic wall of compressibility formed over the wings. Turner's control stick grew terrifyingly stiff, resisting his grip like curing cement. The entire airframe shuddered violently under the immense pressure. He was riding the absolute razor's edge of structural failure, fully aware that a fraction of a degree in pitch could freeze the elevators and doom the aircraft. Below him, the Luftwaffe formation rapidly expanded in his glowing optical gun sight. He crossed their critical 1,000-yard defensive perimeter at an agonizingly fast closure rate, eating up the distance at over a football field a second. For a fleeting moment, the German pilots maintained their rigid box, their strict training fighting against raw human instinct. But the math was too brutal. The closure rate was simply too violent for their discipline to hold. At the precise millisecond Turner anticipated, the German formation shattered. The enemy pilots violently jerked their flight controls, panicking to roll out of the Mustang's path. Their coordinated defense dissolved, and one Focke-Wulf aggressively banked, exposing the broad, vulnerable belly of its fuselage. Turner had exactly what he wanted. He squeezed the trigger on the control stick. 650 caliber machine guns roared to life, sending a concentrated, 2-second stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds slicing through the freezing air. The heavy projectiles hammered into the banking Focke-Wulf, tearing through its wing root and shattering its massive radial engine in a sudden cloud of smoke and debris. There was no time to watch the enemy fighter fall. Turner was still plummeting at near terminal velocity. He immediately hauled back on the stiffened flight stick with both hands, using every ounce of his physical strength to wrench the Mustang's nose toward the sky. The aircraft protested with a deafening groan as the metal wings bit heavily into the denser air. Instantly, a crushing wave of gravitational force slammed into Turner's body. The blood was violently dragged from his head. The world outside the canopy faded to a flat, featureless gray, collapsed into a tight tunnel, and then snapped to absolute pitch black. His vision was entirely gone. He was pulling 6 Gs, completely blind, hurtling upward through a scattered, chaotic formation of heavily armed enemy fighters. For several agonizing seconds, Captain Turner was nothing more than a captive passenger inside a screaming aluminum shell, trusting the integrity of American engineering while he waited in the darkness for the blood to return to his brain. As the Mustang surged into the thinner, colder air thousands of feet above the engagement zone, the crushing pressure of the G-forces finally began to ease. Inside the cockpit, Captain Turner's vision slowly bled back in from the edges. The absolute blackness receded into a grainy gray, and then the harsh, bright blue of the high-altitude horizon snapped back into focus. The immediate contrast was jarring. Just seconds prior, the airspace had been a chaotic swarm of heavily armed enemy fighters. Now, as Turner leveled out and looked over his shoulder, the sky was entirely empty. The rigid defensive box of Focke-Wulf 190s had completely dissolved, scattered by the sheer violence of the closure rate. The only remaining evidence of the ambush was a single pillar of black smoke rising from the German countryside far below, marking exactly where the enemy fighter had impacted the earth. This calculated plunge was not an isolated stunt. The meticulous arithmetic of the high-speed dive attack quickly became a defining element of late-war American fighter doctrine. The pilots of the 354th Fighter Group definitively proved that the Mustang's most lethal weapon was not its 50 caliber machine guns, but its unprecedented capacity to weaponize kinetic energy. This realization irrevocably shifted the paradigm of aerial warfare. The romanticized era of the twisting, horizontal dogfight was effectively dead. In its place emerged a cold, brutal, and unforgiving geometry of speed, structural limits, and intersection angles. Survival in the skies over Europe no longer depended on outturning the enemy, but on mastering the strict, unrelenting laws of physics. For the battered remnants of the Luftwaffe, this tactical shift left a lingering, terrifying psychological footprint. German pilots were forced to realize that their superior roll rates and heavy frontal cannons were entirely useless against an adversary they could barely see. They were now fighting an enemy that treated the sky not as a traditional battlefield, but as a highly lethal mathematical equation. To the veteran German commanders analyzing the wreckage, the Luftwaffe firmly believed they were facing a terrifying wave of reckless, suicidal aggression in the skies over Europe. Convinced these near-vertical plunges were the desperate acts of panicked aviators willing to tear their own aircraft apart. But there was absolutely no panic inside those plummeting cockpits. In reality, their rigid formations were being systematically dismantled by young men performing cold, high-speed calculus, weaponizing the absolute edge of the sound barrier to forever change the geometry of modern warfare.